Thank you very much. So, because this morning's conversation worked so well, having both speakers present at the same time, I thought we'd try it again this afternoon. So I'm borrowing Jim Fackler's approach here. And we have with us today Nicholson Price. He's a professor of law at the University of Michigan. And we also have Leora Horwitz, who is an internist but also involved heavily in deploying and integrating machine learning and AI at New York University. So just want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's session. I'm looking forward to an exciting conversation. So I'm going to start with you, Nicholson, and I'm going to just indulge myself a little bit and ask you a question to sort of get to know the speaker. So someone in law who is interested in artificial intelligence and machine learning, I think that's unique and very interesting. So I'd just love to know, how did you get into this space coming from law?
Yeah, so I'm really fascinated by how the law shapes the development of science and biomedical technology in particular. So I did a law degree at the same time as my PhD in protein crystallography, did some medium data work there, and then moved into legal academia. And I'm really just excited by kind of how innovation happens, how the law shapes it, how the law blocks it, what the law can and should do better. And this is the space where a ton of really awesome stuff is happening, where the law has just so many profound impacts, but it's so new and different that I think the law is doing all sorts of weird stuff here. And so I've been spending the last 5-6 years kind of diving into that, trying to figure out what's going on and how we can do it better.
Cool. And Leora, so you're a general internist, and it sounds like you've been involved in various sorts of research questions for a while. And in looking at your CV, it sounds like you're interested in health services type research and health delivery types questions. So how did you get into the space of machine learning and AI in healthcare?
Oh, well, it's a little bit similar to Nicholson. It's where the action's at, right? I run the Center for Healthcare Innovation and Delivery Science at NYU Langone Health. And we have a large group and do lots of things, but you cannot have a Center for Healthcare Innovation if you don't talk about AI and machine learning. And so one of our groups, I have the privilege of co-overseeing one of our groups, which is the Predictive Analytics Unit, and it's led by Yindalan Appanyanapong. And has a number of other colleagues, and they build machine learning models for healthcare, and so I help to think about how to get from the model to the practice.
Great. Yeah, so it seems like the questions that we'll be discussing or thinking about together involves, so you have a model, now what? Let's put it into the healthcare system and see what happens. So First, let me just encourage the audience to be sure to listen to both of our speakers' talks because they're super informative and interesting. Nicholson's talk really was very clarifying to me as someone in this space. It's like, oh yeah, now I understand why the administrators at our hospital don't immediately want to just throw this new thing into the medical record because it's not reimbursed or blah blah blah. And then I thought for Leora's talk was just really also sort of helpful. It's like, okay, you've got a great AUROC, but that's not everything when it's thinking about deploying a model. So I guess I'm going to just start with Nicholson here. And one thing that was sort of helpful and clarifying about your talk is you sort of laid out the sort of current and standard regulatory environment for healthcare innovations. So these are drugs and devices, and you sort of said, okay, we have the FDA is involved, the patent office is involved, and insurance is involved. So can you just like remind us really quickly about how all those together sort of have an interplay when it comes to a new drug or device?
Yeah, sure. So the three things interact they all have big independent individual roles, but the three things kind of interact in as much as for new drugs in particular, but also new kind of physical medical devices, the FDA has a pretty extensive review process, especially for drugs, right? Clinical trials, super expensive. Really new medical devices as well, but not as quite as much kind of mildly new medical devices. So FDA has these quality oversight rules that also ends up creating a pretty substantial barrier to entry, pretty high upfront costs. The patent system helps innovators recoup those costs by saying, okay, here's the exclusivity right to this invention. So if you've spent, $500 million, $1 billion getting a drug approved by FDA, whatever, no one else can come in for some period of time because the patent protects you. And then all of this stuff ends up being too expensive for anybody to afford anyway, so insurance reimbursement covers it. It's this social payment mechanism, but that also ends up serving both as an incentive mechanism on the front side and as kind of a little bit of a quality guarantee, almost like a backstop to FDA. If something's FDA approved, insurers will generally cover it, but sometimes they'll say, actually, we want more evidence that this is going to particularly work in this situation. And so we have insurers playing a little bit of a patent-like role in terms of incentives and a little bit of an FDA-like type role in terms of kind of quality oversight. But as I say in the talk, kind of all this seems to break down, or at least be much, much different in the context of AI.
Right. And so now as we think about, a new AI system that helps provide care, right? Like, it just doesn't seem like that current regulatory environment is going to offer the same type of assurances, reimbursement to make it all work. So I guess on the one hand, it's going to work if you're a startup company that has some new device that like some new software that ultimately you can get reimbursed for when you put it into the market. But for everyone else, like, how are we supposed to how are we going to be assured that like these new AI, these new software systems are going to be held to the same sort of standards as the drug that the FDA approved?
Oh, they're totally not at all. Or we have no such assurance, like, at all. I mean, okay, that's not entirely true. There are a few products that get approved by FDA. You can go on FDA's website and see a list of things that have been cleared or approved, and there are some AI products in them. There are some things that go through this extensive review process, but there's tons of stuff, including lots of things that folks in this virtual room have developed and then thoughtfully put into use in their hospitals or health systems or whatever, that don't go through anything like that process. Now, my hope, of course, is that everybody in this room, indeed everybody, is doing really awesome prospective and retrospective validation and making sure that they understand how things work and they're doing all the right things to ensure this quality. But in terms of some third party sitting out there saying, yeah, this is good, this works, you've done a good job, developer, and we're now sure that this works, like, that's just not happening for the vast majority of AI involved in medicine, at least as far as I understand it.
And I want to add, even beyond that, even if there were such an assurance and someone external validated the model that was developed and said, this is spectacular, it totally works, even that is no assurance that it will work once applied to your own data set and your own population. And I cannot tell you how often we have acquired models developed and validated and that seem pretty good elsewhere and have turned them on in our system and they do not work for us because of the different ways that people practice or the different ways that data are collected or the different patient populations that we have or the whatevers. And the more complicated the model, in fact, less likely it is to work locally.
Right. So, Leora, to what extent are you involved in these types of decisions? Are you going to turn on a new model at your health system? How does that work at your health system?
So in our health system, first we will try not to acquire a model unless it has some validation that we trust. There's a paper about it. It's a shocking number of these places don't provide any data about their performance. So we try not to we don't even start with those. But if we have one that we think is promising, we will program it and turn it on in the background and run it for a while and see what it does. we will never, ever turn something live that is shown to clinicians if we haven't internally validated it first. And I will say that the vast majority of models stop there. We turn them on in the background and they don't, in fact, work as promised or as designed. And then either we mess with them ourselves, or we recreate something internally based on our own data, or we don't use it.
Yeah, and so it seems like that kind of model is becoming more and more standard, particularly in academic centers. The academic centers have resources. I think we at Michigan have something similar, where there's some sort of committee that sort of looks at models and makes decisions about whether they're going to potentially be of benefit at their health system. I just wonder, like, is that going to be scalable? So this is back to you, Nicholson. What about these community health or community hospitals that don't have that type of resource?
Yeah, I mean, this I think is the big problem and the big question, which is to say, if you're an academic medical center, then hopefully, I mean, if you're one of the places that's doing this work, hopefully you either have the resources to home grow your own stuff, or if you're going to try to import other stuff, then run it in the background and evaluate it, maybe tinker it with it, home grow your own version, or figure it out, or reject it and say, okay, that's not right for us. But if you're not someone like Langone or Michigan Medicine or Partners or whoever, like, those resources just aren't there. And so then you're left with this really unenviable choice of either saying, like, oh, here's a bunch of technology that could potentially be transformative and we just don't have access to it, or the position of trying to say, okay, like, here's stuff that was developed somewhere else. They seem smart and have a lot of resources and they validated it. We're just going to incorporate it, and we don't really have the tools or the expertise to make sure it works for us. And, like, as you said, Leora, that's going to be really problematic because it often doesn't work. Like, different patients, different care populations, different EHR systems, like, that's going to be really bad too. I recognize I'm only saying problems without solutions, but I'm a law professor. Like, we kind of do that.
Yeah, and I wonder, I hearken back to the HITECH Act, that sort of motivated the acquisition and the use of electronic health record systems across hospitals. I mean, do we need something like that to sort of level the playing field for the sort of the next generation, i.e., artificial intelligence to support healthcare, to make sure that there is, the same type of healthcare can be delivered across health systems?
I mean, my dream here is that we've got that a lot of this investment comes from scalable data collection systems, so that it's easier for, like, I don't think it's going to happen that smaller institutions are going to have the capacity to do the evaluation, the home growing on their own, at least not for quite a while into the future. What I think is potentially more likely is the idea that we can push harder on interoperability, we can push harder on the ability of actually collecting data so that these things can potentially be maybe ideally deployed in the background, but also as they're used, data is collected, and someone else, maybe someone who's not at that health center, can be involved in saying, like, oh, like, you've got a problem here, or this is working out, or here's a tweak. That's my hope, but I'm not on the sharp technical end of the stick here. Leora, you better.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I actually think that the onus here is on the vendors, and I think you should not be allowed, in fact, to sell a tool or a model if you're not also selling the infrastructure to evaluate it. And it would not be so difficult for Epic or others to really universally provide the infrastructure and the tools that are necessary to evaluate a model. It's not so hard, actually, but it takes some programming and it takes some effort, and so we home build that, but it's unreasonable to expect everybody to home build that. And so in the same way that many electronic health vendors and others are selling models now and selling the pipeline and the infrastructure to turn them on, so it's not so hard to do that. They've kind of, put that in a box. You could similarly put the evaluation tools in a box, and I think that we as a profession and as a community need to start demanding that.
Yeah, that's music to my ears. I really love that idea from both of you. First, interoperability of data. So so that it's actually easy for researchers at an institution to build a new model to actually test it out at a variety of health systems, community, academic, otherwise. And even the next step of sort of building into the infrastructure of electronic health records to A/B test models would be just extremely exciting. So we have the first question here from the audience is regarding FDA approval. So it's obvious that if you're a drug company and you need to and you have a new drug, you have to get FDA approval. It seems obvious that in most cases, if you're a commercial entity and you have some sort of complex software that drives patient care, that you probably should get FDA approval. But if you're a academic who's built a new algorithm that you think helps you take care of patients with sepsis, and you're actually planning on open sourcing it, should you still get FDA approval? Like, what do you think, Nicholson? You're not a lawyer, you're not their lawyer, but.
Yes, I will make that very clear. I am not a lawyer. I am not your lawyer. That applies to everybody listening here. I am a law professor. I think about this stuff. So I'll make a distinction between kind of 3 different levels of what we might call approval, but FDA approval is actually a term of art. FDA approval refers specifically to either drugs or devices that go through a pre-market approval process, which is the most rigorous thing. FDA also clears stuff, which is things that are pretty similar to what's come before, and that's a less rigorous process, but still, like, FDA puts its stamp of, yes, this is okay on it. And then there's the kind of really informal thing, like, you talk to FDA and they say, this doesn't seem like it's so much of a problem. So the Sepsis Watch team at Duke, in one of their papers said, we talked with people at FDA and talked with them about how we needed to keep a human physician in the loop enough that this wasn't running afoul of FDA approval requirements. And so that's kind of not FDA approval, but kind of, hey, we're doing this. Do you have a problem with it? Is this okay? And the agency, like, kind of informally helps you out there. The last thing I think is the most likely thing that people would want to do, which is to say, talk to FDA, and they'll probably say, no, you don't need to go through this. The agency, to the best of my understanding and experience, is generally pretty willing to talk to people about this. Most of the time, though, I think the answer is you probably don't have to, because there are, as I talked about in the talk, there are a bunch of ways that the kind of medical AI we're mostly talking about doesn't probably need to go through FDA. Probably it's not being marketed, and FDA tends to care about stuff that's marketed commercially. If there's a human in the loop, that means it's not a medical device most of the time, according to a 2016 law, the 21st Century Cures Act. If it's developed and deployed just within one setting, it's probably the kind of if it's a diagnostic test, it's probably the kind of diagnostic test that FDA says we're not going to worry about because it's just in one place. But you've heard me use the word probably like a lot. There's a ton of uncertainty in this area, and I think the answer is most of the time FDA is not going to be involved. To the extent that I've talked to some of you, most of you aren't talking to FDA. If you are, I'm curious. If you're not, I'm also curious. But I think the answer is probably you don't need to. It probably wouldn't hurt. But FDA is not as present in this space as in certainly physical medical devices or drugs, not by a long shot.
Yeah, so one of the things, Leora, that you talked about, is so for drugs, the FDA requires randomized clinical trials, period. Whereas in sort of deployment and integration of AI into a health system, almost no one is doing randomized clinical trials. I don't know if I've ever seen such a study published before, but I don't read everything in the literature. But Leora, you make a strong case for trying to do those types of studies. Can you just sort of elaborate on why you think it's so important?
Yeah, I think it's crucial, and not just for AI tools, but for operational interventions in general. I mean, we make this kind of artificial distinction between giving someone a drug or changing the way that we organize our health system or organize our practice, but both of those influence outcomes. In fact, we wouldn't change our practice if we didn't think it would. And we spend a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money organizing our systems in the way that we do. And we don't know if they work. We phone patients after they go home from the hospital to find out how they're doing and, you know, try to reduce the risk of readmission. We send out letters. We post messages to the patient portal. We put up posters. We have decision support. We do all this stuff, and we have AI tools, and we have no idea if they're effective. And that's a waste of everybody's time and energy. Like, we could be more effective. And so in the same way that I think we need to do these for randomized trials for drugs, I think we need to do them for operational things as well, and that includes AI tools. And it's especially important because we don't really know how giving information changes people's behavior or doesn't. And therefore, it's hard to understand if there's benefit or if there's harm. And there can be harm from these also, from misinterpreting the results, or from having the models be wrong or biased or whatever, right? And so the only way to know for real if the tools are acting as they should and if they're influencing outcomes for benefit or for harm is to randomize. And so we randomize our AI tool implementations.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, so, you know, randomized clinical trials, obviously the, you know, medical clinicians, we think about those as sort of the highest form of evidence, but one of the challenges in doing randomized controlled trials is so expensive. You have to recruit patients, you have to get informed consent. So how do you do that, or how do you get by with doing randomized controlled trials on AI systems? I'm assuming you're not consenting a patient to ask them, can we use an AI system on you?
We're not. This is we have actually an entire program that randomizes work around operations, including AI. And we spent a lot of time setting up the infrastructure and the organizational buy-in first. And so, of course, the first people we talked to are our IRB. And our IRB director is fabulous. And I spent, 4 or 5 months really kind of working this out with her. And the way that we think about these, at least at NYU, is that we think of these as largely as quality improvement interventions, in that we are not testing whether drug A or drug B or treatment A or treatment B is better for outcomes. What we're trying to do instead is test how we can get what we already know to be best practice established and implemented effectively. So we already know it's a good idea to get a mammogram. We might randomize different ways of trying to get people to get that mammogram. We already know it's a good idea to talk to patients at the end of their life about palliative care and goals of care and so forth. What we're randomizing is whether a tool that predicts that they're about to die or not influences people's behavior to get the best practice established. So that's one kind of distinction that we make. So we're not trying to see what's best practice. We're trying to see how can we get people to adopt best practice more effectively. We also make a distinction between research and quality improvement, in that the people doing the work, doing the study, doing the interventions, doing the practice are the people on the front line, are the actual people delivering care. And when we find that something is a better approach versus another, we adopt it immediately. Like it's to improve the care that we deliver, as opposed to generalizably thinking about, is this an interesting or reliable approach or not, and maybe implementing it or maybe not, and so forth. And there's a variety of other distinctions that we make. And some things fall into our quality improvement infrastructure and some of them don't. If they do, then we do not obtain consent. But we do nonetheless take our ethical obligation seriously. So we measure always the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and also the potential unintended consequences or harms. We measure the outcomes as rigorously as we can using randomization, so that we are confident in the results. We make the fact of the trial public as best we can. We post to clinicaltrials.gov. We put in internal newsletters. We announce to people that a thing is happening, so that although we are not obtaining consent, there is at least knowledge. Now, that does not mean that the patient knows that there's a thing going necessarily, but we at least try to, we try not to make it a secret. So we do, we attempt a lot of things to keep them ethical. And I will just say that this is an area that people may disagree on, but we think it's, we actually think it's ethically incumbent on us to do it that way.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about sort of all the things that we do, we don't have any evidence for, right? And the power of doing these sort of systems randomized control trials can provide us evidence for these things it's really exciting. So I think there seems to be a lot of interest from questions about, gosh, what could be done to make it easier to run similar RCTs by modifying commercial EHR systems?
Very briefly, just to say, it's bizarre that we're in a system that says if you want to develop knowledge that everybody can use because we're actually sure that it's like this is generalizable knowledge, that's so much harder to do that a world-leading health center trying to figure out what the right thing to do is like, just to be clear, we are not trying to develop knowledge that anybody else can use, because that would be basically impossible for us to do. Instead, we're just trying to do it within, like, this is a deeply bizarre system that we have set up, that is the particular path that innovators are led down.
That is correct.
I'm not part of the system, I just observe it from the outside. May continue, Michael.
That is correct.
Yeah, so what could be done to make it easier to run similar RCTs by modifying commercial EHRs? I guess, if just a few sentences on how did you guys build up your system, Leora, from the commercial EHR that you use?
So with our randomized trials in general, it depends a little bit on what we're doing and who we're trying to target. I'll just speak specifically to the AI tool. We do randomize this within our electronic health record, and our particular EHR vendor makes it relatively easy to randomize knowledge display by patient. Quite difficult to do that by clinician or by unit. So it's much harder to say, I'd like to randomize Dr. A to see this message and Dr. B not to, and quite easy to randomize, I'd like patient A to display this information and patient B not to. So depending on our project, that sometimes that's more or less complicated. In this instance, the particular thing that we're randomizing right now is a model that's predicting adverse events for patients with COVID. And in that instance, it makes sense to do it on the patient level. We don't really care if a doctor can see it for one patient and can't see it for another patient. But again, as I said before, we don't keep it a secret. So we post the information for half the patients, and for the other half, we write on it, hidden, so that it's clear to people that there is information there, but we are hiding it, rather than having them mistakenly assume, oh, there's no information, the patient must be fine, or whatever. Like, we don't want to mislead. So and we told everybody we're running the trial. So we can randomize on a patient level quite easily, and we just randomize whether the information is displayed or not displayed.
Cool. Here's a question from the audience that I think is sort of interesting, and as someone who sort of has thought about building models and putting it into our health system, you always have to sort of face administrators who have a bunch of costs, and they have a limited number of costs, and so maybe actually they don't want to spend that extra money to get my specific electronic health or my specific AI tool into the record. So should researchers think about insurance? Should we think about ways in which we can get insurance companies to help support our systems that we're building as a way to sort of distribute them better? What do you think about that, Nicholson?
I think it is not. Sorry, I'm going overhead. I think it's hard to avoid thinking about money. The question is where it comes in. And insurers are one possible source of this. I mean, it's much easier to convince administrators, I would think, to put something in if you say, look, we can bill for this.
Yeah.
Another source of money is just the institution itself, which is to say making things more efficient or avoiding costs. To the extent that excess care or adverse events are associated with excess costs, like that's a nice story to be able to tell. Look, I avoided all of these problems, and therefore I say, or this will save money. To the extent that excess care is associated with revenue, That's a harder story to tell, which is problematic, right? If you say, I'm going to avoid these adverse events, but if these adverse events turn out to be super profitable for a hospital, obviously, no ethical administrator would say, well, that's a bad tool for that reason. But the incentives are there, not maybe to push as hard to implement it. So I think it would be nice if a decent amount of stuff was insured, but a lot of the things that people are developing seems like it's really hard to individually bill or to deal with insurers for, right? Like Sepsis Watch, I assume that's just folded into a facilities fee, for instance. Like some things, hey, look, we're going to read an X-ray. Like, yeah, that's the kind of thing you can get reimbursed. But a lot of stuff isn't. One of the interesting impacts of that is you would expect to see incentives that are higher for developing, deploying, and integrating products that feel more like those classical medical devices or procedures such that you can get them individually reimbursed, and relatively lower incentives for developing, deploying, and integrating products that are going to just kind of sit in the background and hope to improve quality, but might not show the sort of immediate impact on the bottom line you'd hope for.
Leora, what do you think? Yeah.
I don't think you have to be so narrow-minded about reimbursement. So I think it depends on, obviously, on what the model is. If it's something that really is very clinically driven, like your sepsis prediction model, there are other ways that one could imagine insurance companies reimbursing for that. So in the same way that if you own a house and if you have a lightning rod on it or you have an alarm system, you can get a discount on your insurance. In the same way, you can make arguments to insurance companies that actually, we have these systems in place that will allow us to take better care of patients and be, have better outcomes, and so we should get better rates, from the insurance company. And people have built things like that into contracts or have, sort of talked about those in the same way that you would argue that you have, great quality in other ways. So, so I do think that one can get that sort of infrastructure paid for in that way from insurance companies. But more globally, insurance companies, I think, are by far the biggest users of AI right now, much ahead of clinical enterprises. And they use it all the time on predicting cost and predicting utilization. And as Ziad has spoken about repeatedly, there's all kinds of bias embedded in those. But they were among the first adopters, and they do all. And so in that sense, if you're building models that insurance companies can use themselves, then that's certainly another venue.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Nicholson about that a little bit more. And in Nicholson's talk, he sort of describes how there's like this spectrum of AI in healthcare. There's sort of AI that's sitting right at the sharp end of delivering healthcare, and then there's just a spectrum of other AI. And some of the AI that's sort of used for population health is sort of somewhere in the middle. And this science paper is a cautionary tale. I mean, should there be more? How can we make sure that those things, we discussed this yesterday, but maybe we should discuss it again today. How can we make sure that those things don't happen in our health system, that models that affect millions of people aren't going to be biased? I'll start with Nicholson, but I'll ask Leora also for her opinion.
I mean, I think about the biggest interventions to try to help these issues as showing up on the front end and the back end. Well, hey, why not? Also the middle. On the middle, like, we should have people that are developing this stuff think about these issues. The talks like Ziad's, I think, are useful in as much as you talk to a couple hundred machine learning developers and say, hey, worry about bias, worry about your labels. Like, that's a really, really useful thing to do. On the front end, I think about building out data infrastructure, right? A lot of the problem, and this came up in the second half of Ziad's talk, talking about the knee issue, right? Like, a fair bit of the problem is data that are kind of too constrained and from a relatively constrained universe, to the extent that we can build out data infrastructure by either providing resources to places that otherwise don't have the resources, or by assembling big national data sets like the All of Us cohort, like that sort of thing, that are more representative data sets, that's going to help reduce bias on the front end. On the back end, transparency strikes me as the important bit, right? Like, the reason that Ziad caught this, or was able to catch this, is like getting access to data from a big health system and probing it and saying, okay, here's what's going on. To the extent that these sorts of things can be less kind of hidden in the shadows behind the scenes and more, hey, here's what's going on, here are our data, interrogate them, it's more likely that we'll be able to catch this stuff on the back end as well.
Leora.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. You know, so much of it is about looking at all, just like even being aware that there's a thing. And so we, you know, that's part of our process internally. We specifically look, and that's always a helpful start. And thinking about what you're doing with the models also matters. So you know, we have a no-show model, right? So, okay, what are you going to do with your no-show model? You could choose to double book patients in that time, or you could choose to like reach out and get them transport and, you know, get them to your office, right? So that also matters. Like how do you use the data?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to ask Leora, you know, one thing that you sort of outlined in your talk, which I really actually liked, even though it was sort of on the face of it sort of basic, like when are models helpful, when are they not? But I thought it was so interesting and useful to think about it in that way. So models are helpful when you know, they don't just flag the obvious. They can actually help you in the sort of levels of uncertainty, and then also they don't make just clearly wrong decisions. And so you know, you sort of were in your talk, you're sort of saying, you know, the AUROC is necessary but not sufficient. There's so much more that is important here when you're thinking about applying a model to practice. And so I'm getting a lot of questions about sort of what that framework, and then also thinking about the other metrics. So you talk about AUP, the area under precision recall curve, or sort of this trade-off, and then sort of other ways in which you can sort of test a model before you deploy it to sort of really convince yourself that this is worth pursuing and this could you know, really have an impact on care. So I'd love you to speak more on this subject.
Yeah, you know, I see this all the time when people are building models, right? Like they build models and they generate excellent sensitivity and specificity. And what we're always doing with models as we're building them internally is we're clinically checking them, right? Like, so you build a model and okay, we'll take the top 5, you know, predictions every few days and look at them, right? Because we're trying to figure out if the model is working or not. And sometimes we do that and it's just obvious after obvious after obvious after obvious, and I'm thinking, well, okay, I'm glad that your model is working, but I don't need you. Like, I just don't need you for this. It's just going to be annoying to me, and that's not always the case. And I actually deliberately gave this example of the mortality model where we were very conservative about the cutoff that we applied, and we only took the ones we were really confident were at very high risk of dying, and as a clinician, when I look at those charts, like, they're all really obvious. I mean, they're really obvious. So I was very skeptical that it would be that there was any point in even turning it on. And we did see that even the really obvious ones, people were not acting on. And so there are times where things are pretty high stakes, and maybe I don't want to act on something that is just my personal gestalt because it's a big step and it's hard, and so it might be helpful in some cases to have decision support for that. But in other cases, like, I just don't need it and it's just annoying. So you do have to think about the clinician, the impact on the clinician of the model. And what I really want, I mean, what I'm desperate for is someone to help me with the hard cases. Like, I really want a model to help me with the ambiguous ones in the middle, well, they could be or they might not be, and I don't know. And I feel like there's all this other data and other patterns that I'm just not able to capture. And so that's what I'm always hoping for in a model. Like, I want to be surprised. I don't want to be surprised all the time, because then I stop trusting you altogether, right? And I don't want to never be surprised, because then I don't need you. So I want to be surprised just the right amount. And that's the trick of making a really good machine learning model that's useful in practice. And I just wanted to convey that message, because I feel like the pure computer science developers don't always, they're not thinking about that in quite that way. And I also really need a model that's not going to take a respiratory rate of 100 and say, oh my God, the patient's really sick, when I know that someone just accidentally added a 0 to a 10, right? Like, I also need a machine learning model not to be stupid about garbage in, garbage out. in the same way that a person can immediately look at something and say, oh, well, that's nonsense, right? Like I also want my machine learning model to be able to say, oh, well, that's nonsense, and ignore the stupidity. And again, they're not always well designed to do that.
Yeah, so, and I think that's really important for you to say. And, my sense of this community, the machine learning and healthcare community, is everyone sort of recognizes that there's more than AUROC, because, the AUROC is a population average discrimination or whatever. But I really thought that categorization was helpful. So. Yeah, there's some questions from the audience. Should we hold the area under the precision recall curve to be as high a standard as the AUROC in all our machine learning for healthcare publications?
So the issue with the AUROC is that it's independent of prevalence. And so it's an intrinsic characteristic of the test, which is good, and that's important, and it needs to be good. Like I would like to see a good AUROC, or I don't want your model at all. So it's not that it's not important, but when it comes to application, because I'm not interested in a population as a physician, I'm interested in the patient in front of me. And so when you pop up a message that says, this is a patient that's at high risk of X, or this is a patient that probably has Y, I'm a Bayesian, right? Like I want to know, how is this information changing my pretest probability? And my pretest probability is entirely dependent on the prevalence of whatever that thing is in the group that I'm looking at. So if I'm starting with a super low pretest probability and you tell me that something is super likely, I still don't really believe it. It's not going to change my post-test probability that much. And so the problem with the AUROC is it ignores prevalence altogether, and that's what the precision recall curve is for. That's why we have the positive predictive value, which is fully dependent on the prevalence. The problem is you can't write a paper really with the positive predictive value except in a specific population. So it would be good, I think it would be very valuable and good to think about that, at least in the population that you're validating it in, and to report that. And I gave the example of the New England Journal paper because it just struck me as so egregious. There's this New England Journal paper and it's got this amazing AUROC for papilledema, which is a really rare thing. Like most people, unless you're Michael in critical care, like we're not seeing papilledema that much. Like that's an indication of increased pressure in the brain, and like that's not, your average eye doctor is not going to come across that. And so they write this paper about this amazing AUROC, and I know that if I implemented that in practice, it would just be wrong all the time. And so these should at least acknowledge like the underlying prevalence in a given population that you might actually apply it to. And I do think that papers should address that.
Cool. Yeah. Well, point taken, and hopefully we'll take this back. The community will think more about that for next year. It matters, the prevalence of the population matters, and at different institutions, different prevalences. I'm going to take this back to Nicholson again. We were talking about this earlier, but the questions come up again. Smaller institutions may not have the resources to develop AI models. It sounds like, Nicholson, you're kind of a big proponent of data and sharing data. Everyone who has the data, people who have the data really have the power. So what can we do everyone wants data, because data is powerful, but what can we do to get
honestly, I feel like this is a place where law steps in.
Yeah.
This strikes me as a place where we want a legal intervention. And right now we're in a situation where there aren't strong incentives there aren't strong policy-driven incentives to spend a ton of money to develop a bunch of data and a bunch of systems and do all that. Like the patent system doesn't work super well in this space. Trade secrecy is much easier. Like the easy way to keep a competitive advantage is to keep all your data secret, like for the incentive side. And then also HIPAA, like it's a thing, it's problematic, got lots of issues. Like we make it really easy for people to keep their data secret, and we have very little incentive for people to share their data. And I think that's a place for law to step in and say like, hey, that interoperability rule where you're proposing that says everything has to be interoperable? Also, you got to share a lot more stuff for research purposes unless you've got some particularly strong reason not to. Like, I think this is a place where law should play a role. Will people kick and scream mercilessly? Of course they will. Does it have the potential to have just utterly massive benefits at a social level? Yeah. So I think this is like a legal mandate type place. So what can you do? Write your congressperson, or I don't know about that.
Encourage you.
Yes, there we go. Oh, can I also ask a really quick question? Do people really not say AUROC instead of AUROC? Like, they say AUROC every time. Nobody says AUROC. That seems very strange to me.
I just say statistic.
I mean, I'm not a machine learning practitioner, so I don't say it. But I guess I'm not cool enough. So I think that's really about all the time we have. This has been really fun. Thank you both, Nicholson and Leora, for joining us for this conversation this afternoon. I think at this point, I'm going to hand back the reins to